everyone for joining and welcome to the SRE Meetup. I'm really excited to welcome two amazing speakers here today. We have Keri, Melich, and Bryan Oliver. Before I give the first speaker scene, I wanted to give a short introduction of myself. My name is Erza. I work for a company called Noble9, where I am a marketing associate and I run the social media. And I have been a part of this meetup community for over 1.5 years, which was started by Kit Merker in December 2019. And then we were joined by some amazing co-organizers. I want to give a huge shout out to them and thank them for the amazing work they put into making this meetup happen. Earlier, I realized that this is actually our 15th meetups, which means that we've had over 30 speakers, and all of them have very diverse backgrounds and different stories. So we've had some amazing sessions over this 1.5 years. And I wanted to hugely suggest all of you to check out those previous sessions. They are on your YouTube channel under Noble9. As a bonus, we have the SLO content there as well. Over 50 talks from amazing speakers and 4 different tracks. So check that out to learn more about SLOs and SRE. And before it's time for first speaker to talk, I just want to explain, because I heard that we have a few first timers here, how the agenda for today looks. So we will have the first speaker begin, and then we have a networking session where I will split all of you into different breakout rooms to discuss an icebreaker question and connect. And then it's time for the second speaker. And after that, we have a dedicated Q&A session. And I will make some announcement by then, so please stay with us. And it's finally time for me to introduce you to the first brilliant speaker. Is Keri Melich. Keri is an SRE at Noble9. And today, Keri will be teaching us about the best practices for pitching SLOs.
So best practices for pitching SLOs. What I really mean by this is talking about some of the blockers that come up when you're talking to your company about this, because it's not really just SREs that you have to convince. It's leadership, it's finance, it's product. There's a lot of people involved in implementing SLOs. So we're going to talk about that. And let me see. Hold on. I don't think my slides are working. Oh, there we go. Cool. So let's start at the basic level. I'm not going to go over like necessarily what service level objectives are. There's a lot of good content about that already. But I just want to point out SLO has been a huge buzzword lately, right? Like I've met a lot of people implementing them at their companies, and there's just a lot of trouble getting buy-in. Half the work seems like it's getting buy-in and implementing it than it is using it. And these blockers can come from anywhere. It's not just engineers and it's not just leadership. So that's what we're gonna talk about today. In general, I think there's a shift in the industry on using SLOs, which is really cool to see. Because I think it's starting the right types of conversations to keeping things more customer focused. And in general, I mean, these conversations are going to be with a lot of really smart people, and there's going to be a lot of differing opinions, and SLOs will give you more data that's going to help take some of the ego out of the room, which has been a problem in the past. So we're going to go over that too. So let's look at, or let's break down who is really involved in these conversations, right? When you're talking about implementing SLOs in your company. So first off, I mean, SRE, right? Ops, that's an obvious one. Depending on the size of your company, this might just be on-call engineers if you don't necessarily have an SRE team yet, or they might be DevOps or anybody who would be considered system operators. This is an obvious one, but I would just like to point it out because you still need to convince a lot of people on the ops side of this. It's not necessarily controversial anymore, but there's definitely people on your own team that you're going to have to argue with about how to implement this or when to implement this. So it's worth pointing out. Next, we have engineers. Obviously, I mean, you're going to be making a major impact on engineers' workflows by setting up SLOs. Like, for example, if you burn out your error budget, you might say that it's time for a feature freeze. That's going to be a huge impact to their role. So a big part of this is convincing engineers how it's going to affect their job. Then there's a product. Pretty much every product manager I've met, and maybe this is just my experience, but it's very much like a go, 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 ship it, get it done. And SLOs can definitely interrupt that. You're not going to always be able to just ship immediately or, build a sprint and finish just that sprint. You're going to have things like I mentioned before, like feature freezes, or maybe you're going to be focused less on building features and more about reliability. So this is definitely going to affect them, and you're going to really need to convince them what SLOs can do for them. And then the big one that I think a lot of people struggle with is leadership and finance. These kind of go together and really depends on the size of your company as well. I think at larger companies that I've worked at, leadership is the one that controls the budget, and both leadership and finance, and I'm talking like exec leadership even, don't always see the reasoning behind SLOs, and especially finance. It's like they're not always technical people, and trying to convince them to either spend the budget to buy a third-party service or build it yourself can be a pretty tough sell. But this is actually my favorite one to talk about, and I'm not being facetious when I say that, but it's really, I really think that SLOs are kind of made for this department. So yeah, it's a fun one to break down and to see them like get that understanding of why SLOs are important. So a big one of that is, why should I spend the budget? And then there's a level of role that's not necessarily a stakeholder in the decision-making process, but they're definitely people that should be involved. That's going to be like legal, for example. If you are a company that has SLAs or you want to set up SLAs, legal is going to be affected by this, or could be affected by this. I think in like an ideal world, your external SLAs would translate into internal SLOs with a buffer on it. So if you have SLAs, bring your legal team in. They're really only going to be advocates for you when you're talking about adding SLOs to your company, because you're going to be giving them a heads up when it comes to air budgets and what could be affecting them. Most lawyers that I've met hate doing paperwork. So if you can give them a heads up that there's going to be a lot of paperwork coming, I think they're going to always be appreciative of that. And QA. QA, again, more bystanders than stakeholders, in my opinion. But I think once you kind of hit an equilibrium with your SLOs, where your deployment and your reliability are kind of lining up with each other, and a lot of times you can start shipping things a lot faster because you're working off of this error budget. QA sometimes just gets skipped because things can go a lot smoother and a lot quicker, and there's less friction already with SLOs. But we don't want to leave QA out of the loop. They're a really important part of this process, a really important part of your pipeline, and a really important part about keeping customers happy. So make sure that QA is involved. Again, they're probably just going to be advocates for you. These are people who are impacted that should be involved in the long run. And yeah, I think they're part of the feedback loop here. And support, if it wants to work. There we go. Sorry, my slides are acting up a little bit. And the support team. I just mentioned feedback loops. Like that's a big part of what SLOs do for us. It helps us translate, how what we're building is impacting our customers. And the support team, they generally funnel in all of your customer feedback, but now you're correlating that feedback with data that you're getting back outside of that as well. So support is another one where they're going to be impacted. I think that they should be involved in the process. They're a really important part of keeping customer relationships happy. And that's the whole point of a company, right? You don't have a company without customers. So we got to keep the customers happy. Yeah. So this is just a breakdown of who I see as like people that you should have these conversations with when you're talking about adding SLOs to your company. They're all going to be a really important part of the process. I'm sure there's even ones in here that I'm missing. These are just the ones that I think are the most standout, that are going to be the biggest, most impacted, rather. And on the other side of this, just some common questions, and we're going to dive in a little bit more into this as well. What is it? What is SLOs? I think if you are looking to add SLOs to your company, you're going to have to answer this question. And there's a lot of ways to answer this question. And like I mentioned before, there's a lot of good content that you can pull from about what it is. But the way that I like to explain it, and this is definitely oversimplifying it, but I really like this explanation, but I use this when I talk to like friends and family, because SLOs are such a big part of my day-to-day job. But I like to just say, I make math pretty. So, I make math pretty so that I can I can give people more data to make better decisions or more informed decisions about what we should do with the product. And that usually gets a lot of nods, like, oh yeah, like that makes sense. And it doesn't matter how technical they are. So that's one that you could definitely use in a lot of ways. But that's just my favorite way to explain it. And of course, depending on who you're talking to, you're going to go pretty deep into the technical side of that or into the actual math. But what is it? That's a question you're going to answer if you are talking about bringing SLOs to your company. And here's another big one. I don't want to lose control of my part of the process. I think that comes from mostly engineering and product in my experience. I think a lot of people kind of worry about nobody's going to say that they don't want to work cross department, right? Because that always sounds like it's going to help. But I've definitely seen a lot of friction with that, just because people are either worried that they're going to lose control about what they get to do and what they enjoy. Product definitely can say, I don't want you to be blocking what I can ship, because sometimes you might have to do that if you're burning through your error budget and you don't have enough error budget left over to ship a new feature. No, like without, significant testing, it can prolong things in your pipeline. So yeah, I think this is a big one that can come up. And I think the best way to tackle it is to just tell them, sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second. My cat moved around. This is him. This is Charlie. Anyway, what was I saying? Yeah, they oftentimes don't want to lose control. They're part of the process, because this becomes more of a collective decision at some point with SLOs, and it's going to affect a lot of different jobs. We don't have the budget for this. This is one that we'll dive into a little bit more. This one definitely comes from leadership or finance a lot of times, but we don't have the budget for this. There's a big argument here. Oh, and I know what I was going to say with lose part of the process is there's definitely a lot that SLOs can do for you, but the biggest thing it does, I think, is aggregate data, and you'll get the chance to make better decisions over time the more data that you collect. So both losing control of your part of the process and not having a budget for something, I think, kind of goes away the longer that you have SLOs implemented. That's a hard thing to sell at the beginning without that data to support it. And SLOs are that data to support it. So it's a little bit of a catch-22, but I think in general, showing how SLOs work and kind of giving them sample data to show how you can use error budgets to your advantage will help with that conversation a little bit. So we don't have the budget for this. That could be the case, but if you factor in, you know, an engineer's budget to build something, or how much it would cost to buy something in the long run, and how much faster you'll be able to start shipping your features, or how much more customers you'll get because you're focused more on customer happiness, I think those kind of questions end up paying for themselves in the end. And where do I fit in with these changes? That's, I think, more when we're talking about some of the bystanders who are affected, legal, QA support. It does affect their jobs. They are going to see some changes in their roles. But in general, I think it's all for the best. I think when you change the conversation to being more customer focused, again, you know, that's always the best for the company. And I think anybody who is not out for themselves is gonna agree to that. So where do I fit in on these changes? There's a lot of support, I think, when you can talk to somebody in QA or in support or in legal and show them how SLOs would benefit them. So I want to go over real quick a couple of like general pros and cons that I see. I've mentioned this one a lot. Of course, I really think that this is the biggest benefit of SLOs, is it makes the conversations customer first focus, right? I think it makes really technical work personable again, which is something that gets lost a lot in engineering. That's something that I've said a lot as well. But there's a lot of really smart people, and putting themselves in someone else's shoes isn't always the skill that I've seen in the engineering world. And I mean that in the best way possible. Like, these are amazing, smart people who are really good at their jobs, and putting themselves in a customer's shoes isn't necessarily like a thing that's in their job description. And if you can take data from SLOs to help you do that almost programmatically, rather than like having to put your own brain in a customer's shoes, I think that is going to help your process and help the company build better tools for your customers. You're going to have happier customers. And if you have happier customers, you're going to end up eventually having happier engineers, because happier customers generally means you're not going down that often. And that means that you have engineers that aren't being paged constantly. And that's going to be better work-life balance for your engineers as well. And then the feedback loop, I talked about this a little bit with QA and support roles, but it really helps you kind of pair up the feedback that you're getting through those support and QA channels into real actionable items. You know, if you can show feature releases are impacting customers in a way that just is making you kind of lose traction, I think that's a big one right there of being able to show data. I keep losing my train of thought. I'm so sorry. What am I trying to say? The feedback loop is basically so that you can correlate actual feedback to data to show leadership that you need to build something new, or to show leadership that you need to have a better testing pipeline, or to show them that you need to focus on reliability. Like, if the feedback loop helps you focus on where you are in your product, I think. And when I talk about revenue feedback here as well, that's where you can correlate actual revenue gain or loss to your customer impact. So if you can say, you know, that we shipped this feature and we saw a huge increase in revenue with no downtime, that shows you that right there, that maybe that's a feature that customers really wanted. And you can kind of trace back to your feedback loop to say, where did this feedback come from that said that customers wanted this, and figure out how you can implement those types of feedback pieces more into your product. So there's a kind of long chain here of how you can use SLOs and connect them with other pieces of information to make better decisions. Cons, I think the two that I've heard the most are, and this is kind of rewording it, I suppose, but people are afraid of change, right? You are affecting their jobs a lot. A lot of people kind of feel like things are working the way they are. Maybe it's not the best, but I've definitely come across this a lot in my career. And change is always going to be a hard thing to fight. But I think having more data, and like I said earlier, like taking it, data can take an ego out of a room, I think. And that's the biggest benefit to me. And SLOs is going to aggregate a lot more data for you than you might have previously had before, or had to manually do before, which takes a lot of time and effort. And like I said before, like you're factoring in an engineer's salary into doing that. And specifically with SRE, like we automate things. That's part of our goals, and SLOs is a way to automate the aggregation of that data. So being afraid of change, that's always going to be a hard one to fight. I think, though, that with some sample SLOs, and there's definitely some open source stuff that you can use here to help kind of bring some of that data in a sample format with some of the monitoring stuff that you already use. Grab some queries from whatever monitoring system you currently use, Datadog or Lightstep or whatever. Put them in an open source SLO type of thing and show that that data is useful. There's a lot of quick ways that I think that you can grab some data from this to make it a little bit easier to talk about the change. And implementation time. This isn't always the case, but I think as SLOs are becoming a buzzword, this is starting to go down, and there's definitely more companies out there that are starting to build tools for you to do SLOs with less implementation time. But especially if you're talking about building it, I mean, that's going to take a long time. If you build it yourself, depending on how many engineers you have on it, it could take a year or longer. And you're just losing valuable time from those engineers to wait on that data. So my two cents on this is, let the engineers do what engineers do best. And you can use a lot of things that you already have in place to create your SLOs, or you can buy something to help you create your SLOs. But you don't necessarily need to take the time to have an engineer do that for you. And I'll dive into that a little bit more of what I mean, because I think the way that I said that was maybe a little confusing. So let's talk about a couple of very specific blockers that I've seen in the past. Why do we need this? I think I've heard people before say, like, why don't we just set up alerts, or we already have alerts set up in our monitoring stack and we don't really need something extra. It's just going to take more time. I think to this, I would say alert fatigue. Like, that's a real thing. When I was at my previous company, I had email alerts probably it was insane. Like, I'd have at least one per minute of some service, because I was signed up for literally every service that we ran. And I just never checked my email, which is kind of insane, but I just never checked my email because I had real alert fatigue and email fatigue. And we had, the urgent ones were set up on like a PagerDuty alert type of thing. But otherwise, like if somebody reached out to me on email, I would end up ignoring it because I just couldn't so easily sort through what was there. And you end up losing a lot of valuable information on there, or, doing a lot of like false alerts. And what SLOs do is it, again, aggregates a lot of that information, and it puts it in a format where you can not be alerted unless you're actively impacting the customer. And that's not to say that we're just ignoring alerts. I mean, we're still getting that data in our monitoring stack or in our SLOs, you can still go there, go to the dashboard, see the dips and see how you're trending, but not getting paged unless there's an actual incident that requires getting paged, I think saves a lot of mental capacity. And just work-life balance is such an important thing, especially in this day and age, especially after a pandemic. I mean, I can't even tell you how much my brain feels better going to a team where there isn't insane alert fatigue. Like, I feel so much better and so much more effective at my job when I'm not constantly being alerted or paged for something that doesn't feel like I need to respond to it right away. Because that's just a mentality that's hard to get over, is needing to respond to something right away. But yeah, so why do we need this? I think alert fatigue is one of the biggest reasons. And I'll say it 500 more times, but aggregate data, like, you're always going to make better decisions when you have more data. And you're always going to, if you can factor in historical data, which I think SLOs definitely can do when you're doing this, that's just going to help you improve your decision making over time as well. So it brings more teams into a room together where they can have more informed conversations, more informed decision making, and actually, track the impact that you're making over time, because that's the hardest thing to do, I think. Build it or buy it. I touched on this earlier. Leadership is a big one to ask this. I've definitely come across we don't have the budget or the time for this, and that could include the budget to pay engineers to do this. I think what comes out of this also is, if you build it, who owns it? If you are a big enough company, you might have your own observability team. Maybe they could own it, but oftentimes it ends up being kind of pushed to the side, and maybe one or two people end up owning it on that team specifically. And maybe those two people leave the company, or they switch teams, and it kind of loses ownership. So there's a big conversation here about whether you should build it or buy it if you are looking to implement it. Personally, because I think building it can get lost very easily, and I've seen a lot of really good services and apps kind of get lost because nobody wants to own it. I would say buy it. Like, there's definitely things in your current monitoring stacks probably that allow you to use SLOs. There's also, like I said, open source stuff that you can use. There's companies dedicated to it now. I mean, there's a lot of ways that you can save time and money by buying it, which sounds counterintuitive. But if you think about, again, engineering salaries and loss of ownership, I think you end up saving yourself by buying it. That's just my personal opinion. I think this conversation really depends on where you are in your company, how big your company is. There's a lot of factors on this one. But in my experience, something like this, where I don't think the math is not hard, people can do it. But if you want to do it in a way that's going to be the most effective for the most amount of people and to give you the best types of conversations, I would say let the engineers focus on the thing that they do best, which is engineering, which is building products, writing code and shipping features. Like, let them focus on that, and you have something in the background doing all the math for you. That's my 2 cents on it. Make it 100%. This is one that, again, comes from leadership often, I think. SLOs are goals, right? And I think people often want those goals to be 100%. But I really think that, so I will say, I haven't experienced this one personally, but I've had a lot of people tell me that they have. And to me, this one should be the easiest one to argue, because usually it comes from management, and management loves seeing performance on, like, if they love having data that shows that they're doing more than what is expected when it comes to performance. And yeah, I mean, if you can, in a totally closed environment, let's say no updates, no major changes outside of reliability, if you can make your SLOs realistic, you're having the right types of conversations about them, you're going to hit an equilibrium pretty quickly where you're going to exceed your expectations if you're making them realistic. If you make them 100%, you're never going to hit it. Like, there's no such thing as perfection. I think personally, there's a really good talk from Dave Renzen that says that perfection is literally just inhumane, which I really like. And yeah, if you make it 100%, I mean, you're never going to show that you're exceeding your expectations, which I think is always going to be a goal. You're never going to, your engineers are going to be hurting themselves, literally trying to keep everything running at 100%. Your customers honestly don't care that you're at 100% because everybody knows that computers fail. Computers are a terrible idea. So don't make it 100%, make it realistic. It's a goal that we want to use to help us make better decisions. And if we're not being realistic about those decisions, this data is not going to mean anything. So that one should be a pretty easy one to argue, I think, because management is always going to say, if they can show that they are doing better than expected, you know, it's the under promise, over deliver kind of scenario, then that's always going to work in their favor. I think the argument here, if anything, would be that it's harder to show, let's say your goal is, you know, 97%, 97.5, whatever. If you are exceeding your expectations and you don't have if you're exceeding your expectations and you aren't burning up your error budget there, then that's room for you to purposefully break things in a controlled environment, right? That's chaos engineering. And that one, I think, is harder to describe to leadership sometimes, that you want to purposefully break things. But I think if you can show that purposefully breaking things, doing practice failovers, is always going to help you in the long run, because it's going to help you recover faster when something does happen. It's going to help you figure out where the gaps in your product are when something does break. Helps you, fix security holes. There's a lot of benefits there. But I think that not showing on paper that you're exceeding your expectations can sometimes, I should say, not showing on paper when you're exceeding your expectations, when management knows that you are, because you're using up that error budget to purposefully break things, I think can be a little bit harder of a conversation. But again, like, you're preparing yourself, you're being proactive about incident responding, and that's going to lower both the amount of and the total time you have in incidents, which is always going to be better in the long run, right? It's more data to help you recover faster. It's more data to help you figure out where there are problems before those problems happen. Yeah. So I guess I assumed the Q&A was going to be directly afterwards. That was a little rough. I apologize. I am not the best public speaker, but I am practicing and getting used to it. So thank you all for bearing with me. And I will be in the Q&A, but if you have any questions that you can think of afterwards too, you can always at me on Twitter. I'm not the biggest Twitter user, but I'm trying to be. So I will do my best to respond to everyone. But
yeah, so I'm really, really excited to have Bryan Oliver from Primerica here with us tonight. We had a change of speakers. Natalie Davis was supposed to be here with us this evening, but she had a family emergency that she needed to attend to. And so Bryan very graciously agreed to join us on a last minute notice. But he's got a really great topic to talk about with us, and it actually dovetails perfectly with our previous presentation. I'm sorry, you guys can hear my kid in the background. So, with no further ado, I want to introduce a very good friend of mine, Bryan Oliver. Bryan, take it away, brother.
Thanks, Zach.
Thank you, Zach.
All right, let me pull up my screen and then we'll get started. Share. No, that's the share button, not the present button. There we go. Let's hit SLO on that. Okay, so yeah, as Melich mentioned, my name is Bryan Oliver. I run the cloud engineering, DevOps, and starting to build the SRE team at my company. And today I wanted to talk to you about something we call non-functional requirements and how we map those to SLOs. So I wanted to start off with a quote. This is from one of my favorite books, Beyond Legacy Code. So imagine I came up to you and I said, I would like you to do something for me. And you go, fine, what? And I said, something, now do it. You're just going to kind of laugh at me and look at me funny like I'm a weirdo. And so keep this in your mind as I go through my talk, because it kind of has a purpose and a theme behind it. So if we take that and we kind of map it to a real world example, executive says, my customers are complaining about the service and I want you to fix it. And the engineer says, what do you want me to fix? And the executive just says, the system, the application, it's unreliable. The engineer will probably pause for a few minutes, look at him a little weird, and then he'll pull up his APM dashboard and go, which part? And the point of this is that we're working in a distributed environment, and it's not possible for executives or leaders in today's world to come to engineers, come to reliability teams and just say, the service is unreliable, fix it. So we need a better language to communicate, and SLOs get us part of the way there, but we didn't want to teach our leaders about error budgets and how to do the math and all that kind of stuff. And so we've kind of come up with a process that works for us. So that's what I'm here to talk to you about today. So let's start at the basics. What's a non-functional requirement? Those of you that have done like Six Sigma or whatever, you may have seen some of this, so it might be a refresher for you. I haven't done that stuff. This is just stuff I've learned as I've gone, but hopefully this is helpful. So a non-functional requirement is like, imagine you have a mobile app, and that mobile app has 5 buttons or whatever, and those buttons do things. Those were probably defined as stories or requirements inside of an Agile board, and some developers wrote it, and then they did acceptance tests, and then they went and validated that the user was actually pushing those buttons and running analytics and all that kind of stuff. Well, a non-functional requirement is where we say, we want certain things to happen, but the user is never going to know about those things. So like if you're writing features, you're providing something to the user. Whereas if you are, say, making a dashboard that looks at the response time of the application, you are providing something to the user, but it's invisible to that user. You're providing something to a different kind of user, like a business person. So why do we call them non-functional? It's really just that they're not functional to the end user. So it's just a really easy way for our leaders and project managers, et cetera, to understand what it is we're asking them for. We're asking them for what are the things under the hood that you need from IT in order for this application to be successful. And not just through UI and services. There are other things that go into that. So looking at kind of some of the differences, I think I touched on this a little bit. These are actually real ones taken from our company. As a user, you can import your banking information from a trusted third party instead of typing in your banking info manually. You can decline or accept marketing information during an application process with a checkbox. Or you can view your policies after you've submitted them. Whereas in a non-functional world, maybe a business user can see how many applications have been submitted that month. Or as a product owner, you want to know how many of those applications were submitted successfully, because you as a product owner want to know what the reliability of that key critical component is of the user clicking submit application. How many times does that fail? And lastly, as a security engineer, you probably want all personally identifiable information, if you have any, to be encrypted. So those are good examples of functional versus non-functional. And I'll help you write a few in a minute. So what are the requirements of a non-functional requirement? They have to be bounded, independent, negotiable, and testable. And so what I mean by this is what's an unbounded NFR? An unbounded NFR might be something like, I expect the service to be available 100% of the time. There's no boundary on that. It's infinite, and it's also impossible. Independent, you don't want NFRs, kind of like SLOs, although sometimes they are linked. You don't want them to be linked. So what I mean by that is one NFR should not depend on another. Negotiable, much like SLOs, non-functional requirements are negotiable. The business leader can come and say, I want a dashboard for seeing all those applications, and I want it in Power BI. And the engineer team might come and say, we don't have Power BI, we have Grafana, and we'll give it to you there. And that's a negotiation. And then lastly, testable. And I'll touch on this a bit in just a second. So it's probably, of those different tenets, probably the most important one. We want our NFRs to be testable. So in a typical development world, you might write stories or tasks or whatever. And at the end of those, you usually have acceptance tests. And those acceptance tests are often automated in a modern shop. So going back to those 5 buttons, you're going to write some kind of UI test that says, do those 5 buttons exist? And if they don't, that test is going to fail. Well, you should be able to write tests for your NFRs as well. Some of them may not be able to be automated, but quite a few of them should be. You know, if an NFR translates to a service level objective, you can test that that SLO is actually being tracked in your monitoring system. And you can write a test for that, just like the dashboard we talked about a minute ago. If that dashboard doesn't exist, it doesn't pass the test. And so the NFR is not complete. So I kind of talked about that a little bit, so I'll skip this here, but basically just talking about how we test them. There are different types of non-functional requirements. You can have environment, data, maintainability, capacity. I talked about security with the encrypting data, creating dashboards. Also alerts are non-functional requirements. So who should be alerted when and why? Those are all non-functional requirements. So to give some more explicit examples, these are real ones from one of our applications. And like not all non-functional NFRs can map to SLOs. We'll talk more about how that mapping works. Some NFRs are more for the development team. So for example, the application will support Chrome, Firefox, and Safari. Those are non-functional requirements. The user is probably never going to know that unless they open it up on Internet Explorer. I really hope nobody has Internet Explorer anymore, but if you do, the application should say, sorry, we don't support that. That would be part of this non-functional requirement. Every transaction is backed up within 15 minutes of transaction completion. This is a NFR that would probably go to the DBA team. The next generation application, that requires a dashboard that shows us number of applications per day, week, month, year. So these are all non-functional requirements that the business or the product owner wrote and handed to IT and said, can we do these? Can we negotiate these? So let's now talk about kind of how this translates to site reliability engineering. And this is sort of the secret sauce. And so we have the business write non-functional requirements. And then as an IT team, as I mentioned, we negotiate with the business, we convert these non-functional requirements into projects. Some are more complex than others, like supporting all those different browsers. That's probably a small project to make sure that that actually works across the entire stack, setting up SLOS labs and all that kind of fun stuff. We then set presentation outlines for how we correlate these NFRs to SLOs. And then the advantage that we get is we don't have to teach executives and project managers how to design SLOs. And we can take the requirements and craft those NFRs into SLOs that actually make sense. So what I really mean there is I don't have to go to, the head of like our insurance business or something else and say, here's what an error budget is and how you calculate them. She's not going to care. Her job is her customers, right? So what we do instead is we say, write non-functional requirements with your product owners and then hand them to us, and we can convert these into things that actually make sense on the IT side. So going back to the quote, what we think about here is non-functional requirements, they give the business a language that makes sense to them, because the business always thinks in requirements. They go through an intake process and they're writing requirements for their application. So we're just adding another step to the process that already exists for them. We're just saying, hey, don't just write the things that you want to be functional for the user and how you're going to generate money. Also think about how you're going to save money, how you're not going to lose money, and write requirements for that as well. We can take those requirements and convert them into SLOs, as well as other projects and tasks and stories. And then there's no more arguing, like we mentioned in the real world example above, over go make it reliable, but we need requirements. You know, that back and forth that always happens. Next slide, maybe. Down, up. Oh, there we go. Okay, so talking about NFRs and SLOs now. There's a lot of similarities between the two. Those tenets we mentioned earlier, bounded, independent, negotiable, testable, those things hold true a lot of the times for SLOs as well, so they map quite well. They both are providing a specification, but not an implementation. So for those of you that have read the Site Reliability Engineering book, you've probably seen how they delineate between the SRE specification and the SRE implementation, or the SLO, not SRE. And in the differences there, it's basically, we're going to document what our SLOs are and publish them on our wiki or something else. We're going to implement those with either our project management tool or something else. That's how we'll track it. And we'll set those SLOs up in our monitoring system. So Grafana or Dynatrace or whatever you have. That's the implementation. It's the same for non-functional requirements. The business is just saying, this is what we want, and we're not going to tell you how to do it. We just are saying, this is what we want, and this is what we need to be successful. And then lastly, yeah, they provide implementations that are invisible to the end user. Some NFRs are not invisible to everyone. Like I mentioned before, they may lead to dashboards and analytics and other things, but they are invisible to that end user. Oh, come on, there we go. So how do we map NFRs, or mapping NFRs to IT and SLOs? I think I mentioned this, not all of them map to SLOs, but the ones that do, they provide a useful mechanism for creating SLOs. So and the kind of the advantage that we get out of this is by requiring the business to do it, we then are able to take those and actually start setting up SLOs at the beginning or the middle of a project instead of the end. So we could start doing that translation process early, like right after intake, we can start working on a project and setting up SLOs from their NFRs. There we go. All right, so enough of the explanation. I'm going to kind of jump into a couple of examples that may help it click a little bit more. So the first one, this is a real NFR that was provided by the business. The platform service should alert the 24/7 on-call if the service is unavailable between the hours of 5 p.m. and 3 a.m. I didn't write it here, but they also provided us another one that said it's less critical, but we also want to be alerted on if the service is unavailable between the hours of 3 a.m. to 5 p.m. But we don't care about that as much as 5 p.m. to 3 a.m. And they said the reasoning behind that is that a majority of the applications are actually submitted between 5 p.m. and 9 p.m. I think since coronavirus happened, they just happened to notice that a lot of people were working during those sort of early evening hours all of a sudden. So this sort of became a non-functional requirement that, hey, we really care that the service is working during those timeframes. And so for us, you know, we don't want to say this is more important than this and try to script that in some weird alerting way. What instead we want to do is we want to try to map that to an SLO. And so if you try to put this onto a graph or a visual, really what you end up with is two SLOs. You have, in the time frame, I didn't mention this in the previous, they were, for just the general SLO, it's a 1 month, 99% availability target. But during that critical time frame, they basically want 100%. They're not saying that, but we're going to negotiate them to that point. So the way that we kind of come to a compromise there is we say, okay, we're going to come up with two SLOs for your service. The first SLO is 99% availability over a 1 month time frame. So if your error budget exceeds the value of 1 for the 1 month time frame, we'll alert the normal on call. You know, it won't be 2 a.m. when we send that alert. However, if the error budget rate exceeds the value of 1 during that time period that is super critical, so that 5 to midnight time period, it's still a 99% target, but it is scoped much tighter to basically a 6-hour period, right? And so, or 7-hour period. And so what we're saying here is I want 99% availability during the time of 5 to midnight. And if I'm not getting 99% availability during that time frame, wake somebody up, because that's when we're receiving all of our applications. And so that's how we took this NFR and converted it into SLOS. The second one, the platform. So I don't have a graph for this one. I only had time to draw one graph, but I still wanted to bring it up anyway. So this is that second one. So that was saying, if the service is unavailable from 3 to 5, we're gonna just alert the business hours on call, just that normal time frame. So what that really means is, we have a small team, and we're not gonna wake them up at 4 in the morning for this problem, or I guess in this time frame we are. But if the error budget burn rate exceeds the value of 1 within the period of, say, 1 month against our 99% target, then we'll send an alert. So it's probably not going to ring the phone as much as the other one, but it's still an SLO that we want to track. So now I'm just going to kind of jump into some of the questions we got from the business in showing them some of this, and also talking to them about NFRs. So the first question we got was, do we need to write NFRs for every single version of our application? And we said it really depends. If you're releasing brand new APIs with that new version, you probably need to write non-functional requirements. If you're fixing a vulnerability or updating your package.json or whatever, you probably don't need non-functional requirements, especially if you're not making impacts or changes to the user. Another question that we got was, what about analytics? And so I kind of mentioned a little bit before, that executive saying, I want it in Power BI or Dynatrace, et cetera. And so basically what we said was, you need to separate the implementation from the specification. So just how we write SLOs, we asked our leadership, write NFRs that are not tied to the how, tie them to the why. So, why do you need this non-functional requirement? What impact does it have on your user if you don't have this non-functional requirement? So just like with a dashboard or analytics, all that really matters is you getting the analytics process in the way that you want, and not necessarily the how that's actually done. And then I think I got my slides mixed up a little bit, but I had one more example, and this was kind of more tied to that analytics question. So the way that we would take a, say, analytics or dashboard non-functional requirement, we'd say, okay, the service should have a monthly report sent to our business partners, and that report should have monthly availability numbers, average response time, number of applications, right? And so the way we map that to an SLO is we say, okay, the service should send that report to the business within 5 days of the end of the month. Our indicators are 4 days, 3 days, 2 days, 1 day. And we're going to alert on 2 days and 1 day saying the report still hasn't gone out, the report still hasn't gone out. And your burn rate is essentially approaching day 0. And that's all I had. I probably would have put in more, but like I said, Zach kind of pulled me in for this presentation like 4 or 5 hours ago. So I put these slides together and tried to get what I could. But this is a process we're actively going through at our company right now. So I thought it'd be fun to share.